If your organization is ready to embrace edge computing, we have good news. The 2023 AT&T Cybersecurity Insights Report provides everything you need to know to get started. In the report, we identify the common characteristics of edge computing. We found edge use cases are rapidly coming online, and we reveal how to secure edge computing. Most importantly, you'll learn how to prepare for your edge ecosystem. Get your complimentary copy of the report today. Visit securityweekly.com/ATT cybersecurity. That's securityweekly.com/ATT cybersecurity. Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. Follow us on LinkedIn for updates across our organization, show highlights, and more. You can find us by searching for Security Weekly Productions. All right, and for our second interview today, Keith Jarvis joins us to talk about the latest insights and observations on cybercrime. Keith Jarvis is a senior security researcher working in Secureworks' counter threat unit. He has over 15 years of experience studying cyber attacks and is a subject matter expert in both malware analysis and cybercrime. Welcome to the show, Keith.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Apologies in advance. I have COVID, so I'm trying to stifle coughs as I talk. And if I draw in too much air, it's going to trigger a cough. So that's why I sound a little funny when I'm saying stuff.
Yeah, I'll give you a little bit of leeway then.
I appreciate it. All right. So yeah, a lot of this discussion is going to be based around this 2023 State of the Threat Report, but also just your general knowledge in the area. And I'm especially excited that you've been in it for 15 years because that's there's a lot to talk about there. If you have that history, if you know that history, cybercrime has changed a whole lot in that time. So maybe I don't know. It's interesting. During our prep call, we were talking about Mirai and the fact that you guys don't really even track it that closely. So I'm interested in your perspective, from having this, hyper-focused perspective on cybercrime trends, really like looking back at the last 15 years. And I don't know how often you guys have been doing the State of the Threat Report, but I assume it is not your first time doing it. What are the kind of biggest, broadest trends that you've seen up to today?
Right. So yeah, a lot has happened in those 15 years. What it was like 15 years ago, say circa 2006, 07 was, sort of the advent of the banking Trojans. That was the major moneymaker for cyber criminals at the time, was to break into people's either commercial or consumer banking accounts, wire money, ACH money, move that through the traditional global banking system, launder it out. And there was a lot of criminal organizations that were very experienced in this. And that continued through the early 2010s. And it started to get more and more difficult, mostly because of the countermeasures that the banks were taking because they were losing so much money through that. And at that same time, cryptocurrency emerged in the early 2010s, 08 through 2012 is when it really took off. And one of the groups that was involved with traditional financial crime that ran the game over Zeus botnet sort of invented ransomware as we know it, file encrypting ransomware. For a while before that, we had this sort of screen lockers that came on and said, oh, we found some illegal files in your system. You need to give us a prepaid card. Those existed for a while, but wasn't until 2013 that they actually started to encrypt files. So these organizations that were really old school financial fraud groups sort of helped us on our way to the ransomware reality that we have today. And at the same time, some other groups outside of that innovated, namely the SamSam group, which is an Iranian-based group. 2015, 16, they sort of pioneered that sort of enterprise attack version of ransomware, where they would take down entire organizations after getting into a network and moving laterally through the network and fully compromising them and then hitting them with ransomware. And then in turn, those same old school financial fraud groups said, oh, that's a pretty good idea. So they started to retool their botnets around 2018 to sort of facilitate that style of attack. So you saw them both leading and following in one of that, in this major trend that we've seen. That's such a problem over the last 7-8 years, which is ransomware. So that's like by far the biggest change that we've seen in the last 15 years.
Yeah, and there's a lot of interesting stuff to dive into there that I wanted to ask about. One of the first observations here, and I think you even have a chapter with a name like this. This is something I say, I've been saying for a long time, is that you don't really stop attackers. You tend to force a shift. And I remember when we saw that shift towards this extortion business model leveraging cryptocurrency. And, it did seem like there was a time that we were doing really good. I'm trying to remember what we called them, but the type of ransomware that would get auto-generated to be unique and undetectable to AV, and you basically get custom just-in-time ransomware delivered to your machine from like a drive-by download or something like that. Exploit kits, is that what we call them?
Yeah, so that was part of the delivery mechanism, but you're right, it was often custom built on just in time, like you said, and delivered to. Back then it was just an ordinary consumer, so you'd have just your machine where you download it, and that would be infected, and
they wouldn't target it. Yeah.
Oh yeah, and they might only get you for $500 or $1,000, and like I said, it was at that perfect confluence of time where cryptocurrency was emerging. And those off-network prepaid cards like MoneyPack, et cetera, were coming off the market. So it was like just perfect timing for cryptocurrency to enable that to really take off.
Yeah, and it's kind of my observation there was that you don't really stop cyber criminals. You force a shift in tactics, right? Like, so if we get really good at stopping a particular kind of malware, they're just going to shift tactics, right? So it's trying to predict those shifts, I imagine is difficult for you and difficult for the average defender. In fact, I was having an interesting conversation on social media today about I've been predicting, that ransomware, and I'd love to get your take on this, but ransomware itself is just a lever, right? The business model is extortion, and for a long time, encrypting files was a good way to get somebody to pay that. But we've seen folks move to exfiltrating data and threatening to leak it publicly has been another approach. So curious to your your perspective. Well, first of all, I'd like to know like what are the trends there? Do we see a shift in moving away from ransomware altogether, or and the actual lever, moving away from crypto ransomware to maybe more the, steal all the data and ransom the company, the employees and the customers. It seems a lot more to give a lot more options to the criminal group than simply just encrypting the files.
Yeah, there has been a measurable change from just file encrypting across the board to basically single extortion attacks, which is really not ransomware anymore. It's just breaking into a network and stealing data and then extorting them, right? So ransomware is not involved. So we're seeing that in increasing numbers, but it's still like a 90-10 split for if we have a known ransomware group, the attack that they prefer is one where they do use that extra lever of file encrypting ransomware deployed throughout the network. But increasingly, some groups are saying, well, it sure saves us a lot of time if we don't have to fully exploit a network and distribute an executable throughout the network to encrypt everything. If we just steal the data, that's still pretty good leverage. And a lot of people, depending on the type of data that's stolen, that may be enough for them to go ahead and pay out. And I think what we've seen as a side effect of that, and it kind of ties into what you're talking about with your earlier guest, is the sort of increased cruelty of some of the groups where they are going after nonprofits, hospitals, and they're using the really sensitive data like people's medical diagnoses and stuff like that as the leverage, their personally identifiable, PII, right? So they're saying, here's this really valuable, sensitive stuff that nobody wants released, and you're going to have a really hard time legally if we do this, and that almost supplants the leverage that you used to get from having destroyed their network, basically.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember when I first saw BEC, I was like, of course, that this is like the completion of the trend from cybercrime away from complexity. Like I remember, like if you're going to steal credit card numbers and have to sell those, like the amount of steps and the amount of work it would take, buy an iPhone, with a stolen credit card, sell it in some other market, it's just such a convoluted multi-step 17-step process. And then all of a sudden you see BEC where it's like, I'm your supplier. You owe me $1.2 million. Send it to this bank account, and somebody does it. Like I imagine the first time a cybercrime group saw that work, they were like, okay, yeah, this is going to be the new thing.
Yeah, absolutely, man. And if you can steal more money easier, then everyone's going to do it. Everyone's looking for margins, right? And that's legitimate business people as well as cyber criminals. So they're going to go to where the margins are. And certainly BEC has shown that you can steal large amounts of money. You still then do have to wheedle it through the financial system. You do have to eventually launder it. So there's still some of that traditional crime step. You do have to have money mule networks and stuff like that. So it's not something that everybody can do, but there's a lot of crews that are making that work for them.
Yeah. So what's the latest on, like I've seen a lot of, a lot of components of this get taken down, right? We've seen a flood of takedowns where like the legal framework and big companies like Microsoft, have been able to take down things like Emotet. We've seen tumblers get taken down. We've seen like the Genesis market. I was going to bring up Infostealers later, get taken down. How much of an impact? How usable is that extortion model with cryptocurrency anymore? Is it getting significantly more difficult for them to be able to extract that cryptocurrency and turn it into usable currency for them?
No, not really. I mean, certainly when you take away some of their tools they use to obscure those transactions, like you mentioned, tumblers, Bitcoin, which is still the main currency for extortion payments, pseudonymous, right? It's not easily trackable, but there's certainly entire companies that are made of an industry vertical out of tracking those payments and then telling law enforcement where those payments are going. So it's still quite useful for these sort of extortion payments, and I don't think that's unlikely to change. And we've even seen some threat actors go to more untraceable stuff like Monero, but that's really a minority.
Right. Yeah. I remember we used to see Monero miners everywhere. Like there'd be this amazing hack, right? They do this amazing stuff and have access to all this super sensitive data that, they could have used to extort companies and stuff like that. But like the final move, Monero miner. And you just be like, oh my God, like what, this has got to be like a group of teenagers or something like that. The lack of imagination or realization of, the naivete of what they had access to. So are we seeing less of that, less Monero miners,
No, that's chugging along. So that's probably one of the top ways that if you're a relatively unsophisticated or maybe uninspired is a better word, threat actor, is to, even though your attacks may be sophisticated, the end result is just we're going to use the CPU resources here to chug away at Monero, and it's relatively low risk, right? I can't remember the last time somebody involved with one of these was indicted or extradited or any of those things. So it's pretty easy way to just sort of in the background, shave money off of, an easy way to monetize, a large number of infected machines, basically. Easy.
Yeah. 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 So I mentioned Infostealers. This is kind of a fascinating move here in terms of malware. We've seen some pretty big breaches where malware gets on an engineer's machine, somebody with access to infrastructure at a large company. And, maybe it's not even targeted. Again, you have this cybercrime ecosystem, where there's different roles played by different parties. And, maybe whoever's running the Infostealer malware just puts it up in a in a market, sells access to Uber or to Okta or whoever, LastPass. And I don't know, maybe it's more targeted. You could tell me, but I find it interesting. It seems to me like kind of it's cred stuffing 2.0 because, instead of stealing the actual credentials, you've got an OAuth key, which is actually, you could argue is better than credentials because MFA isn't a factor that you have to worry about anymore if you've got a signed in session, right?
Yeah, and we know that's one of the main things that the Infostealers are targeting is not just the stored credentials, but it's also the session cookies that then can be used for some period of time to, if not change the password or something like that on the account, but then to at least access it before you're reprompted to sign back in. And that's been used in a number of high-profile attacks. And these marketplaces that we've seen, like Genesis Market, that sell the Infostealer logs, have really sort of industrialized those logs. Like you can go on there, and search for a particular domain name or a type of cookie, and say, "You give me all the logs with that particular site logged in," and then that way, a targeted threat actor can actually go use those very untargeted Infostealer logs to then perpetrate an attack. And it's almost at a scale of industrialization where the credit card markets were, 10 years ago, where you could just log into the dark web. You could say, "Give me 100, Amex business accounts with this limit," and you didn't even have to interact with another human being. You just paid the money, and they were deposited in your account. And that's the same way it is right now with Infostealer logs.
Right. And something I found a little surprising in here. I remember last time I was on the enterprise side in 2012, last time I was responsible for security for an organization, 100% of our malware infections were due to drive-by downloads. And 100% of those was because we had an old version of a Java plugin because there was, one group in the organization that needed to use a retail website that was using Java plugins. And, but it seemed like since then, browser security increased to the extent that I felt like I didn't really hear about drive-by downloads anymore. So it was surprising to me that was one of the things that you highlighted here. So I wonder, like with just all the isolation that has been introduced and locking down malicious extensions more, what's the mechanism? How are these drive-by downloads working these days? How are they getting past all the browser security we have these days? Are they out-of-date browsers that have vulnerabilities in them? Or is it just using social engineering to get people to click OK to install it?
Almost exclusively social engineering. So you dip back into the bad old days, 7-8 years ago, when browser security wasn't as mature as it is now. We talked about exploit kits earlier, when you could legitimately be browsing on the web and have your system infected through an exploit and have no idea that happened. Well, drive-by downloads these days are, you go out onto the web and you're searching for something, and you find it and you download it, but it's misrepresented what the file is, or you're in the process of browsing for something and a page pops up and says, "Hey, your Google Chrome is out of date. You need to download an update." You click on the button, you download it, and it's malware. So that's the social engineering aspect of it, is the primary driver. You're still getting these things injected into legitimate ad networks, especially on Google search. But really, it's far and few between where we see a legitimate browser exploit being used for the broad distribution of malware. Sometimes that's used for targeted attacks, but very rarely for this type of commodity malware.
Right. That totally makes sense. And again, that's just one of those shifts that we forced, right? Like the browser security got really good, so why not, like BEC, why not just ask nicely for your target to do what you need them to do?
Definitely easier.
Yeah. Yeah. So another item you have on here, that this report dives into supply chain attacks. So I mean, this is something again that has been really concerning. I think I saw earlier this week that hospitals in 4 states couldn't accept ambulances because some kind of software that they use got attacked. So, certainly that, the idea that an attacker, cyber criminals can, get the benefit of scale by attacking suppliers, particularly software or service suppliers and providers. How much of a, again, like with Infostealers here, like I know there have been some high profile cases, but I don't have the big picture here. So I wonder, like how big of an issue are people typo squatting, plug in software libraries, stuff like that, and how much of it is just like a few high profile cases?
But I think if you extend the definition of supply chain to anything masquerading as a legitimate application, then the Infostealer sort of ecosystem, crime ecosystem there is a big part of it, because when people are out there trying to download legitimate software, they're often getting these Trojanized versions of it. Yeah, OBS, right, was a big one. But when you talk about what I think are the core sort of supply chain attacks, where a software developer and distributor is compromised in some way, and then their software is used to deliver something else, a backdoor or something like that. They're pretty rare, but they're pretty high impact when they do happen, and they're frequently in the realm of pretty sophisticated threat actors with lots of resources. And even then, when they do capture hundreds or thousands of victims, they're pretty frequently trying to narrow that down to a very small target set of high value people. For example, when North Korea is perpetrating them, they're looking for people who have relationships with cryptocurrency exchanges. The Chinese are looking for defense contractors or companies with IP, right? And it's not so much just trying to drop an Infostealer on a system. So it's definitely a big concern, like both aspects of it. But certainly, I think people are more worried about the big one, where it's the application that's deployed throughout their entire enterprise, and they get a bad update from their vendor. It comes down, it's legitimate, signed, by all accounts, it's fine, but it's actually delivering malware. Like what we saw with 3CX, or earlier this year, and before that, SolarWinds, et cetera. Those are the ones I think people really, really worry about.
Right. Like I remember we had a case, I forget how long ago it was, but where NPM, some owners of NPM basically got cred stuffed, I think, or maybe social engineered. And it wasn't the NPM library itself. It was the install script for the NPM library that was, ran the malware, which of course was a Monero miner, if I recall correctly. So yeah, if you installed that NPM library outside of NPM, you were fine because the install script wouldn't run. Like if you did an apt update or something like that. But if you installed it directly from NPM, it would, that install script would hit you. But again, that, like, I don't think there were any actual breaches that occurred from that. It was spotted pretty quick, so, I don't know. Are there places where we're not looking close enough for this, that this could really sneak up on us and get us, or, it's like they're tightening up stuff a lot. Like now it's required for a lot of maintainers to use MFA, for example. There have been some moves there.
Right. Yeah. And they're doing that just because of that reason, because the ecosystem is so large and the dependency web is just so insane that there's probably an application in use at your company or anyone's company that you don't know that there's some random dependency, and at some point that maintainer could go off the rails. You could Trojanize it, or we've seen this with browser extensions a lot, where bad actors will purchase a relatively popular extension, and then as soon as they buy it and they control it, they can put their own code in there. But with npm, Python, pip, all these sort of repositories for modules for the different programming languages are a perfect spot to get into a network, because there's all sorts of applications that are constantly updating their modules against that. And there's really nothing besides community a community watching it to prevent that from happening, or antivirus maybe seeing that there's a Monero miner being dropped because you've just installed this thing. But that's pretty much the only thing coming between that sort of supply chain attack and you, right?
Right. Another difference that I've noticed here, from maybe 10 years ago to today. 10 years ago, we would give the advice, here's what you need to do to protect against cybercrime, which was largely opportunistic at the time and wasn't targeted. And just a completely different level of effort you would need to protect against nation states. But now 10 years later, a lot of nation state tools have kind of trickled down, tactics have trickled down. Now that criminal groups seem more organized or run more like businesses, they have R&D budgets. Do you see the gap between nation state attacks and some of these cybercrime groups going for 7-8 digit paydays? Is that gap narrowing, in terms of the sophistication and what organizations have to do, the lengths that they have to go to be able to defend against these?
It's probably narrowing, but not by a substantial degree. I mean, we see even the largest sort of ransomware operations, something like Conti a couple of years ago. They were making tens of millions of dollars. They had dozens of people on staff. But then once all their data leaked, you just saw what a more unorganized mess the whole thing really was. So it didn't look anything like a properly organized criminal, conspiracy. Didn't look like a military unit engaged in espionage. So it was just kind of chaos. That doesn't mean that all ransomware groups are like that. But at the same time, I think governments will just naturally always be more resourced, right? Because just the financial resources that a government can bring to bear will be far more than any criminal organization can. And other resources, maybe the military runs the group that's actually doing the network intrusion, but they also have teams that can then take the files and they read a language and they can go through the data that's stolen and process the important stuff. Or maybe they're out there setting up shell companies to buy infrastructure, and they've just got those sort of resources that criminal organizations don't. So there's probably some closing of the gap there, and there's certainly tactics that are trickling up from one side and down from the other. So they're sharing a lot of that information, but I don't think we'll ever see where we've got criminal organizations that can match a government sponsored organization.
Okay. And I don't know if it's just because I'm looking a little bit closer these days, but it seems to me, especially when I prep for the show, I look at a lot of news sources, and databreaches.net is one of those that I look at. And to do some prep for this show, we're talking about ransomware a lot in the news segment of the show. There's a bunch of stories on it. Katie has a Substack newsletter, and her latest one is about increases of ransomware. And I was just going to go grab some stats on ransomware for the month of November. And the RSS feed, I think, is limited to 50 on databreaches.net. And I couldn't even get, I think November 13th is as far as I could go back. Is it just me, or is there a lot more ransomware going on right now? And the kind of follow-up question to that is, how are the bad guys scaling this? How are they able to hit so many companies seemingly all at once? Is it a small number of groups doing this, or is it just because there's so many ransomware groups now?
So
sorry, that was a lot of questions.
Yeah, no, I'll try and address the first one and then probably forget the rest of them, but remind me. So yeah, I think the amount of attacks is certainly on an upward trend right now. For a while there, it was kind of hovering, sort of steady state, but it's certainly on the rise now. I think this summer we finally crossed 10,000 victims that had ever been listed on a ransomware leak site, which is a pretty big milestone. And we know that the number of victims that actually get published on there pales in comparison to the number that are actually compromised by those same groups. So it's probably a multiplier of 3x, 4x, could be 10x of the actual number of victims who don't make it onto that website. So certainly the problem is still here. It's getting worse. And I think that the way that they are scaling that up is we've seen, we talked, I think earlier about, dwell time, at least on our initial call. And, that dwell time for a threat actor to be in a network until they deploy ransomware has gone down, precipitously over the last year, from about 5 days to 24 hours. And I think actors are speeding up their operations for a number of reasons, which means they're gonna churn through more volume of victims. The victims are probably getting quite a bit smaller. You see a lot more dental offices on these sites than you do, Fortune 500 companies. And a part of that is that these groups are increasingly uninterested in really spending the weeks and weeks inside of a single network trying to fully exploit it to really get that devastating ransomware attack. They're more content to get in a day, maybe 2 or 3 days, steal some data, maybe deploy ransomware, and then just by law of averages, if they exploit 10 victims versus 5, right, they're probably going to get more payout from just churning through more victims. So that's kind of the way that they're scaling right now. It's a pure volume game.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, and I assume a lot of their operations are automated these days. So it was something with generative AI. I was wondering, if they could even take that to 10x another level. If you could have like a GPT style LLM, even do the negotiation part, the small parts that are still manually done by a human. Or I assume they still are. I don't know what they have and haven't automated.
Yeah, we know that a lot of those negotiation sites have a chatbot on them, so there's no reason that any of the LLMs that have the chat capability couldn't just be plugged right into there, and that'll free up their resources to go do something else. In their conspiracy. But I think where we've seen automation is a lot of the attacked methods that were used like by a human threat actor, hands-on keyboard, after getting access to a network. A lot of that stuff is increasingly automated. So for example, one of the drive-by downloads that's quite prevalent is one called SOCGolish. So this is one that sits on compromised websites, makes you think that there's a Google Chrome update or Mozilla Firefox, etc. When first of all, they geofence it to just Western countries, the richest countries. So there's already a triage step, making sure that they don't get countries where the victims don't have as much money. And then once they run the script on your system, they see if you're joined to a domain. So there's another triage step. They don't want ordinary consumers. They want somebody who's on a corporate network and joined to Active Directory. And then the next stage of the malware runs the traditional reconnaissance commands. It looks at who the enterprise and domain admins are, how many domain controllers there are, who am I, the sort of things that you would normally do as somebody breaking in when you first land on a system and trying to get your bearings. And all that stuff is automated and happens within 10, 15 seconds. And before that victim goes up to the threat actor's dashboard to see what victims they should exploit that day, they've got that map of the network. They know how many endpoints there are. They probably know who the victim is. So a lot of that stuff that used to be very manual is now automated form. And most of the groups are doing some form of that, where they're baking in the reconnaissance into the first stage malware. So that way they don't have to run all that stuff and then do the manual triage.
Right. Yeah, it seems like each individual group doesn't have to be all that sophisticated. There's a lot of benefit of the whole community here. Kind of joining forces and having the an ability to specialize in different areas.
Yeah, I think that they certainly benefit from having specialists, people who can do infrastructure, people who can do the CNE aspect of it, the people who are experts in Cobalt Strike, and that's kind of why we saw Cobalt Strike become the de facto standard. Is so many people became familiar with it, then everyone just sort of used it, even though there were other options available. And what a lot of these groups have also done is document extensively. So, they all have playbooks, they all have flowcharts on what to do when an intrusion happens. Like if you land on a system, here's the next steps you should take. Here, you should go look for their hypervisor and try to encrypt that. And they're all trying to, in a weird way, like document things to bring up the next group of people behind them, to educate them on how to perpetrate these attacks, because that's just going to make them more money if they've got more people in the trenches running those attacks on their behalf.
And so another thing in here, that I'm a little hesitant, I should say hesitant to agree with is patching. It's I've been doing vulnerability management for a long time, and I've rarely found an organization that can really, in a meaningful way, patch quickly enough, especially when looking at the data, how quick attackers are to exploit things. It seems like, and I'm eager to get your thoughts on this, but it seems like mitigations, like back when Log4j and Log4Shell came out, the companies that did the best in that scenario weren't the ones that could find it and patch it the quickest, but the ones who are already doing, a lot of outbound traffic blocking, on systems that really didn't need outbound communication. Like, it didn't matter if you could exploit something coming in, if it couldn't reach back out to the C2 and establish a connection outbound, didn't really matter. So just wondering if you have any data on how quickly you have to be able to patch things, for patching to be an effective control versus, having mitigations in place that will make likely attacks inert or more difficult to pull off.
Right. I guess it all depends if a proof of concept code comes out. Really, that's what accelerates things more than anything. So vulnerability can drop and maybe give you some time to patch. But if the working exploit code comes out, then we know from experience over the last how many years that it's going to be immediately exploited en masse against the entire internet. So you would really have to have a very aggressive patch regime to get in front of that. I guess what we recommend is that if you have any sort of device that's on the public internet, that you need to have, a patch regime that can patch it within, at a minimum, 24 hours. Just be like, red alert, this is out on the internet, so it needs to be a priority no matter what sort of downtime we have to incur to make that happen. But the other problem is a lot of these exploits happen on appliances, which are essentially black boxes that you're not allowed to put your own EDR monitoring software on. Maybe you can't even configure the logs to come off of that box, and it's just a lack of visibility about what's going on there. So if you can't patch, you can't even really see what's going on inside that machine, and that's a real problem. And I think you kind of got at it is surrounding those sort of devices with other security controls, network monitoring. So at least what's been talking to it, how much data has been coming in and out of it, and when. And then having a plan for, basically sequestering it if you do suspect a compromise. But again, really making it a goal to patch it as fast as possible. And maybe that's, like in your experience, not always possible. But I'm not sure what other what other things you can do there.
Yeah, so maybe as we wrap up the conversation here, what are some of your takeaways from your recent research? What should companies be focusing on, and maybe do you have any thoughts? It is getting close to that time when everybody needs a prediction blog post, needs to put out a prediction blog post. What do you see shifting that people should be ready for?
Yeah, well, my prediction last year was going to be there's going to be an increase in attacks that originated from USB sticks based on some emerging data we saw from two different threat groups. That didn't materialize, so my prediction fell flat. So maybe I'll just stick with something a little bit safer this time. But
think about attacks via USB sticks. I just saw a story on that.
Yeah, it's not something that's gone away entirely, but there was some velocity behind these two groups. So one was a criminal ransomware group called Goldrake. They distributed Raspberry Robin, and there was one called Bronze President, a Chinese-based threat group that distributes PlugX, and they both used USB to great effect. And we were seeing it quite a bit in our IR engagements. And I thought, hey, maybe that's something that people have sort of forgot about, just like drive-by downloads. You don't really think, well, the USB stick is going to be the way that they get into a network, but it was for many of our clients. So yeah, it didn't quite materialize. Both of those groups sort of backed off, but it's still, you know, one of those things you really got to be you got to know if a USB stick gets plugged in your network somewhere, you know, can you track that back to date and time and what was on it and so forth like that. So it's kind of like basic security hygiene, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's as far as I know, dropping a bunch of USB sticks in a parking lot still works. You know, one of them will get plugged in at least. All right. Good stuff, Keith. I really this was selfishly a lot of fun for me to get a bunch of questions answered that I already had. So I really appreciate you coming on the show and letting me fire questions at you.
Awesome. Thanks for having me again.
And it's a great report. Highly recommend checking it out. You guys did a really good job with the executive summary. I love how it's formatted. Really easy to go through instead of just blocks of text. They really break it up in a useful way. And yeah, highly recommend checking this out. Don't go away. We'll be right back in a few moments with the weekly enterprise news.